Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the March 28th meeting of the Courtenay City Council. And we're actually reconvening a meeting that started at 3 o'clock earlier today, and we had an in-camera session. But just to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation, and we're pleased to be here today. I'd like to welcome council members and staff and any members of the public who are tuning in. I'd like to acknowledge that our mayor is away today on a well-deserved vacation, and I'm therefore sitting in as acting mayor. That's a rotational assignment that we take based on a month-to-month arbitrary decision. So we will start the meeting, and we have the adoption of minutes of the regular council meeting from March the 14th, 2022. Moved by McCollum, seconded by Frisch. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. We have a late item, which is a request from the Comox Valley Ukrainian Society. And is there any objection to hearing this late item? Hearing none, I'll take a motion to include this on our agenda. Moved by? I'll move that we include this on the agenda. Moved by Frisch, seconded by McCollum. All those in favor? That's carried unanimously. And I'll just read the request. Council received a request from the Comox Valley Ukrainian Society requesting support for a fundraising event that will raise funds for the Canada-Ukraine Foundation. This foundation, or the Ukrainian Society rather, has requested the use of the Evergreen Lounge and Kitchen or an alternative location to cook pierogies and host a fundraising event. Should council wish to waive the rental fees in support of the pierogi preparation and subsequent event, staff have prepared a draft motion for consideration. As a late on the table item, consideration of the motion at this time will require unanimous consent. We've achieved that, so we'll move to the motion. Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Acting Mayor. I'm happy to move that based on the request by the Comox Valley Ukrainian Cultural Society, CVUCS for short, received March 24th, 2022. Staff be directed to work with the CVUCS to identify an available date for the CVUCS to access the Evergreen Lounge at the Philbrook Center, including the attached commercial kitchen or other appropriate facility to facilitate a fundraising event in support of the Canada-Ukraine Foundation, and that staff be directed to not enforce the rental fee rate as outlined in the Recreation Facility Rental and User Fee Bylaw number 1673, 1992, and waive all applicable rental fees in support of the fundraising event.
Okay. Seconded by Councillor McCollum. Is there any discussion? Councillor Frisch.
Thanks again, Acting Mayor. I guess I was just curious what those fees would add up to that we're thinking of waiving in approximate or general, or sorry.
Like in ballpark?
Yeah.
Hang on, we'll get your mic on so people can hear you.
Ballpark, $200.
Wait, can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Ballpark, $200, I would think.
Okay, good to know. Thank you very much. Yep. Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so we'll hear back from staff on that. And there was a fair amount of correspondence on this in the last number of days between the mayor, CAO, and council acknowledging this request from the society under the exceptional circumstances that we're seeing just now. And I think that most of our citizens would agree with us taking this action in support of relief efforts for the Ukrainian circumstances. So without further discussion, all those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. And I was remiss in not welcoming back to our council table Councillor Theos, who is with us today. Welcome back, Councillor Theos. It's really good to see you again. Yeah. And I will acknowledge that we do not have Councillor Cole Hamilton with us today. He's returning from a vacation, it being spring break, but we're happy to have who we have, and we'll carry on. So we do have an item to rise and report on. I'm going to read it right now. In the special in-camera meeting held today at 3 p.m., Council passed a motion to rise and report on the following resolution of Council. That correspondence be sent to the Comox Valley Regional District, Town of Comox, and Village of Cumberland to support a request to the Union of BC Municipalities that the Strengthening Community Services Grant, Administration, Management, and Funding be transferred to the city of Courtenay as soon as possible, and that staff work with representatives from the Comox Valley Coalition to end homelessness, and other social service providers identified by staff to submit an amended application to UBCM that is reflective of initiatives that can be achieved in the remaining grant period and are in alignment with the objectives of the original grant submission. And that the city make application to UBCM to seek approval of the amended grant submission and request the grant be extended to the maximum time frame, and that council rise and report on the resolution immediately as to undertake the direction of council and at the open council meeting to be held at 4 p.m. on March 28th, 2022. My apologies for my misspeaking, rather unfortunate. I don't know whether it's because I watched the Oscars last night, and but we won't go any further into that. There's no need for any discussion. We're simply rising and reporting on a matter that was considered in camera. And with that, we'll hope that there's some relief in the community among those who were concerned about that particular program matter. So we'll move on to item 4, staff presentations and reports. We have a presentation related to the proposed regional parks and greenways services from Mark Harrison, Manager of Parks Community Services Branch, Comox Valley Regional District. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say that that I'm very excited to be here, and very excited to be finally at this stage to be able to bring this this background study and this service framework forward to Courtenay Council. So just before I kind of start and kind of talk a little bit about how we got here and the process, and before I introduce Alan, I just want to kind of just do a general thank you. First of all, I want to thank Alan Nielsen, who's just been really a strong leader throughout this process and has really helped guide us, and all his input and thought have been very much appreciated. I also want to thank all the regional parks working group, which is basically comprised of all the parks managers of the each local government. So within Courtenay, I want to thank Craig Rushton, and I also want to thank Susie Sanders for all their input and contributions towards this framework and the background study. And then lastly, I want to thank all the CAOs whose input was really very critical and very instrumental in helping to develop this proposed service framework that's being brought forward. So really quickly, how did we get here? I think our current model that we use to protect regionally significant areas for parkland is a bit challenged. Just really brief history: the Comox Strathcona Regional District, that they actually established a regional park service in 1971. And through that service, we were able to
Mark, if you can hold on a second, we seem to have lost our video here. We'll just take a moment while staff look into this and see if we can get everything back on stream.
So might calling just a 10-minute recess.
All right. With apologies to everyone, we're going to recess for 10 minutes while we attempt to sort out the technical difficulties that we're experiencing. Thanks.
Hi there. This is the City of Courtenay's IT manager. There have been some technical difficulties over the Zoom chamber there, and so the meeting will be taking place in person at the CVRD chambers. So if those other participants right now who are in the meeting, if you wouldn't mind making your way over to the CVRD building and council chambers, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. And if you're watching this from home, please note that this will be, unfortunately, in person, but you can follow up on the minutes in our website in the near future. Thank you.
All right. Thanks very much to staff for sorting out those difficulties, and we will reconvene now. And perhaps I'll ask Craig Rushton. Did you want to make any introductory comments, or do you want us to just turn it back over to? Okay, great. Back to Mark and the presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. So where I left off is that I just wanted to just talk a little bit about the history about the Comox Strathcona Regional District, which actually had a regional park service that was established in 1971. Now in 2008, the CSRD actually dissolved and it was replaced by the CVRD and the Strathcona Regional District. And I think that that's important because when that happened, the CVRD actually became the smallest RD in terms of land mass. So I think where we are at now, as opposed to where we were previously, it's a very different situation. So since that time, 2008, I think there's been a lot of documents that have come through the regional district board, things like the Nature Without Borders in 2008. It talked about conservation and kind of us working, the local governments working together towards conservation goals. There was the Comox Valley Strathcona or sustainability strategy in 2010 that spoke about jointly acquiring lands between all the local governments to meet our public park needs. And then obviously in the regional growth strategy in 2011 talked about collaboration for services and things that benefit the region as a whole. So I think, I think we're working at this situation where we understand now that collectively we can achieve more. I think what we've seen too with COVID and things is that our park systems are at or exceeding carrying capacity. And that's not just the parks within the electoral areas, but that's the parks within each of the local government municipalities as well. So I think that pressure that's heightened through COVID has kind of shown us the need, and it's also shown us the benefits of parks. And, our region is growing. And I think as it grows, there's going to be more pressure on us to supply these much needed park systems. Lastly, I just want to kind of say that the Regional Park Service, it's really about complementing the existing park services. It's not looking at any kind of replacement of our existing community park services. So really, it's looking at new parks. So very quickly, in terms of process and kind of where we're at. So in December of 2020, the CVRD Board of Directors asked us to embark on a 3-step process to look at potentially establishing a regional park service. So the rectangles in purple is basically where we're at right now, which is step 1. So it speaks to a collaborative background study. And then it also talks about establishing a general direction for the service, which will be supported by the board, which is basically the proposed service framework that we're bringing forward. So what we're doing now with this step is that we're presenting this background study and this proposed service framework to each of the local governments to collect feedback on that. And then we will be reporting all that feedback back to the board at hopefully the end of April to explore actual service establishment. If the board supports service establishment, then we would move to step 2, which would be establishing it through an actual service establishing bylaw. And then once it's actually established through bylaw and it gets properly funded, then we can kind of move to step 3, which is looking at the strategic plan, which is really looking at the details and meat and potatoes of what a service could deliver. So on that, I just want to present Alan Nielsen of Nielsen Strategies, who is the author of the background study and the proposed framework. Alan is a recognized authority on local government services and delivery, and he does have extensive knowledge of regional park services. So I'm sure he'll be able to answer any questions that you may have at the end of his presentation.
Thank you very much, Acting Mayor, and thank you, members of council. It's and to Mark as well, and to Craig. Delight to be here to discuss regional parks and to present this report. That's okay. Just to talk about the background study, Acting Mayor. We begin with kind of the purpose of the study, and in essence, the study is a research piece that looked at what regional parks are, why regional park services get established, who's doing what, and what we can learn from them. And then importantly, what a regional park service in the Comox Valley could look like. So in all, really to help local governments make informed decisions on the service. So to help the local governments of the Comox Valley, that is, including the city of Courtenay's council. And then finally, to advise on the design of a service framework and the elements that make up that framework for a regional park service here in the Comox Valley. The study introduces and defines regional parks, and it sets out to look at, first of all, the key characteristics to distinguish those parks from others. So when we look at regional parks, we see, for example, that they in general tend to be parks that are established and, well, acquired and established to protect nature and regionally significant ecosystems that can exist in municipalities and in electoral areas throughout the region, to connect people to nature, to be active in nature, allow people to be active in nature, and also, particularly when we look at linear parks and regional greenways and local greenways for that matter, to connect parks and places. The study also looks at benefits and reasons to create regional parks, and Mark touched on a few of those benefits already. Some of them are set out in the RGS, the Regional Growth Strategy, where we look at the sustainable growth pattern that the region and its local governments have collectively determined how to create. And so a regional park service certainly provides those kinds of benefits that allow for that sustainability. Ecosystem services that we all know about, protecting biodiversity, the improved physical and mental health benefits of regional parks and parks in general, for that matter, are becoming well known. And council may recall that about a month ago, Parks Canada came out with a new program through which they are working with mental health providers around Canada to register those providers and to allow them to prescribe access and regional park passes to people to assist with mental health. So gives you just a sense of kind of the mental health benefits that are recognized. Social connection, cultural recognition, particularly with respect to First Nations and their cultural heritage in the landscape here. And finally, economic development and tourism, as those benefits are also front and center through regional parks. The history of the regional parks in the Comox Valley is reviewed in the reports. Mark touched on that history. I won't speak about it any longer. Just talked about how it began in 1971, and then a little bit later in the early 2000s, we started to see new reports coming out, all of which spoke to the value of regional parks. And the study also profiles the existing local parks and greenway services in the Comox Valley. And as council likely knows, that every jurisdiction in the Comox Valley does have a regional park, I beg your pardon, a local parks, a community parks service in place. The city of Courtenay, town of Comox, Cumberland, and the electoral areas as a whole have local park systems in place. It talks about those systems, and it notes that all of those systems that are in place right now, those services, have a number of different types of parks. And several of those types of parks do have regional park characteristics, but many of them also don't have regional park characteristics. Many of them are local in nature or citywide in nature, feature active recreation, and so forth. So things that distinguish them from regional parks. The study looks at the investments that have been made and what's in place in those systems, looks at the plans and strategies that are in place for expansion. All of the different systems have them, and then talks about the need for collective action through some kind of regional service. And the study really does speak to the idea that there's a sense, a strong shared sense of the need for a regional park system to address a number of different items: growth pressures, crowded destination parks, and Mark talked about that a moment ago. Increased demand, which we don't anticipate is going to reduce or abate at all as a result of opening up from the pandemic. Perceived inequities across the system. So the idea that in some places there are larger park centers than in other places, and that if we can have a broader regional park service, we can start to address some of those inequities. Greenways being important. Another key thing that came out through the study that was conducted with the working group. The background study importantly profiles 6 different regional park services from other regional districts. And the 6 different regional districts were chosen with care to really reflect the high growth areas of the province, because we know here in the Comox Valley, of course, it's quite high growth. So we wanted to learn from what was in place in those other places. Each of the services in the other places as well has been around for some time, some of them for over 50 years in the case of Metro Vancouver. And so we're able to kind of really look at how these different services were established and how they've evolved and what lessons we can learn for those. So when we look at the 6 regional park services, we first of all look at 3 on Vancouver Island. So Vancouver Island has the Capital Region District, the Cowichan Valley Regional District, and the Nanaimo Regional District. In the Lower Mainland, we look at the Metro Vancouver system and the Fraser Valley service. And in the Okanagan, in the Central Okanagan Regional District Service, the regional park service there. And
Excuse me, Alan, I'll just interrupt for a moment to let everybody know that our technology, we now have the ability to stream the audio portion of this meeting to those who are online, and staff will be posting the visual aspects tomorrow. So just to let you know that you're being broadcast far and wide as we speak.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll speak extra clearly then. Thank you. The other systems in place for Acting Mayor, for each of the other systems, we looked at a number of different characteristics. We looked at the size of the population served, the jurisdictions that participate, the definition of the service, because that's an important element, and how those definitions can really define or help to kind of determine how big the system becomes and what kinds of parks they take into account. The mandate and the scope, what it hopes to achieve. In other words, the system size and the diversity, the governance, how decisions are made for each type of service. The service delivery, is it done in-house? Is it done using contractors? Is there a hybrid approach? Funding for the regional park services, a very important consideration that we wanted to look at in the existing regional park services around BC. The acquisition of lands and the use of a strategy to help set a course for acquisition, and the taxes on a typical residence, what we're expecting, what different places pay for the service, so we can get a sense of kind of what's typical around the province. And looking then at the strategies and the plans for growth and some of the challenges that each of those services over time has encountered. And looking at those different services allowed us to come away with make a number of observations that can apply to right across the board. And what we see, for example, first of all, is when we look at the definition of these services, a commonality across the entire 6 services that we considered is there being a primary focus on ecosystem protection and access to nature. So regional parks really being focused on protecting ecosystems and providing access to nature. Greenways are also a feature of all. In particular, in recent years, greenways have become very important across all regional districts as we start to look at linear parks and as we start to move away from car-oriented transportation and look for different active transportation methods that, of course, we're seeing here in the Comox Valley in the local areas and in the municipalities, but looking at regional connections to those greenways we see as a feature across all of the regional districts we considered. Cultural heritage becoming very important in all of the regional district park services, and we see that across the province as well. I spent some time with Metro Vancouver services. It was the regional park service in Metro Vancouver was part of my department when I worked at Metro Vancouver. And there we had set up management agreements with the Tsleil-Waututh and with the Squamish First Nation and with others. And we're starting to see those types of agreements becoming more important in regional park services. Strong demand and growing. We see tremendous demand, particularly over the course of COVID, but we're anticipating, and each regional district is participating, seeing that increased demand continue for the benefits we talked about earlier. Another point, another observation we can make from looking at the different services, and we see this in all of the services, is full participation. So what we mean by that, every jurisdiction that is part of each regional district is a member of that regional district's park service, including the islands. And there are a number of different regional districts we looked at that have islands. So we looked at the Capital Regional District, Metro Vancouver, the Cowichan Regional District, and Nanaimo Regional District. In each of those cases, the island portions also were formed part of the service area for those services. Funding for acquisitions, the fact that it's safeguarded in each of these places because each place has recognized through its service that acquiring parklands for protection and for access to nature is paramount to the importance of the service. And a variety of acquisition methods also was another common feature. I will just mention one other point, if I may, Acting Mayor, and that is that when we look at each of those different regional districts, one of the points we see as well, which is common to each regional park service, is that the existing local services, which as Mark says, complement the regional service. In each of the existing local services, we do see parks that have regional park features. And so that is something that is perhaps not surprising when we think that regional park services tended to follow behind municipal park services and local park services in unincorporated areas. They tended to emerge out of those when jurisdictions realized that despite all of the efforts they were making within their own jurisdiction, they could do more together to protect different areas, to acquire different areas and so forth over a broader region. So we see in every local area that there are regional park type or regional characteristics or regional park characteristics in different local parks. And that's important because another point we have seen in each of those areas is that despite the fact that there are regional park-like parks in each of those local areas, in no regional district has the regional park service taken over, if you will, or regionalized existing parks. And I think that the reason for that is because since every jurisdiction has parks that could kind of or do have regional park characteristics, once we start to pull that thread and start to figure out, well, which one should we regionalize? Everybody lines up and says, well, we've got one. And I remember in Metro Vancouver, the city of Vancouver came to us at one point and said, well, the region should pay for Stanley Park because that's kind of a regional park. It's a destination park. And so the region said, well, great. Okay, well, let's get to the table then and start making decisions for it. And they were like, no, hold on. We don't mean governance, just we want you to pay for it. And then North Vancouver was like, well, how about Lynn Valley? We want you to pay for that as well. So it just, after a while, places just realize that that's a never ending thread pulling exercise. And they kind of decide that, no, we're going to start fresh with new parks. Anyway, that's the review of the other services in other regional districts. I will just mention then, importantly, all of that background research looking at kind of the reasons for having regional parks and the benefits of those park services moving then into looking at the existing local park services and how they kind of create a nice foundation for the Comox Valley, and then moving into the regional, I beg your pardon, the comparative research of the different regional park services across BC. All of that then led up to the consideration of a framework for a Comox Valley Regional Park Service. We looked at different building blocks. Every regional service has different building blocks that are common to all services. We looked at those, we identified options, and we explored. We then presented the material to, and Mark noted this earlier, to the CAOs of the 4 CAOs of the local governments in the region. And with the CAOs then, we had a series of discussions to help refine the different recommendations, and we developed a service framework. And that service framework, a copy of which is in your agenda package, Acting Mayor, is a document that sets out and kind of provides some commentary on each of the elements that make up these different, that all regional services, but in particular regional park services. So the first one that we look at is a service definition. And what we recommended here and set out in the service framework, the proposed service framework, is to have a definition of 2 parts. The first primary part would be to protect in perpetuity regionally significant natural areas. And within that protection and within the protection of the natural environment, then within that context, to provide opportunities for people to access, connect with, and enjoy nature. So the first element then of this definition would be focused on protecting regionally significant natural areas. The second element would be to provide regional greenways as off-road linear parks with different trails, and that those greenways would be planned and acquired in a way to connect to local government greenway and active transportation corridors that are either in place now or that are planned to be in place. So that's service definition. Service participation, another important element in any kind of service framework. What we've suggested here, based largely on discussions, but also even more so on the examples of other regional districts, is to recommend that all jurisdictions of the regional district and all parts of each jurisdiction participate in the service. So that would include Hornby and Denman Island as well. And this type of approach, which has full participation, really has been taken to recognize, or in recognition of, I should say, the broad public benefit of regional parks. And I noted it's a feature in other systems as well, and those systems have been structured in a way to ensure that that broad public benefit is recognized. Regional parks have an intrinsic value, and so it is less about the degree of use and more about simply the fact that having them, and particularly in protecting regionally significant natural areas and sensitive ecosystems, is of value to the broader regional community. And so, using that premise, then it would make sense for us to have a recommendation to include the entire regional district in that park system. Service governance is a particularly important element to consider. And what we've tried to do with service governance is to create a system that ensures that going forward on decisions that have to be made for the regional park service, because many of those decisions are money related, either in setting up the budget for the service or in acquiring lands for the service, that decisions have broad support from across the region. So we have suggested setting up a regional parks service committee to provide recommendations to the board on all matters. And a key reason behind recommending the establishment of a committee is to introduce a customized voting system at that committee level. And I'll explain the system, and then I'll try to explain why it is we needed to introduce it at the committee level. What we've suggested is a service committee with 9 members, 1 member for each 10,000 population. So what we would see then across the regional district is that the city of Courtenay, being the largest, would have, and this 10,000 population metric or unit, if you will, is applies even after the 2021 census. So we see Courtenay then would have 3 members, Comox would have 2 members, and each of the other jurisdictions would have 1 member each. So for a total of 9 members. each member would get one vote on every decision, on every recommendation going forward. And what we've suggested is that there be a 2/3 majority required on all matters, including acquisition of lands, the development of an acquisition strategy, and the annual budget. So we've suggested that we've tried to set a very high bar to ensure that there is broad buy-in for these important decisions. I should note that when we have this 2/3 supermajority approach, which is somewhat unique in local government, it's not completely absent. There are some cases where we've seen this in different contexts, but by introducing this supermajority on this type of governance system, we try to ensure that no one single jurisdiction can decide an issue and no one single jurisdiction can veto an issue. So jurisdictions, there's a built-in bias, if you will, to ensure that there is consensus building and that there is broad support for all recommendations going forward from the committee to the board. Now, I will mention that, and this is a very important point, is when we look at the Local Government Act, the Local Government Act is very clear in stating which types of issues are those issues on which a regional board can introduce different voting rules than those set out in the Local Government Act. Acquisition of lands and the passing or the adoption of an annual budget for a service are not votes that can deviate, are not matters that can deviate from the Local Government Act default voting rules. So what that means is that at the board level, decisions on acquisitions of lands and on financial and on other financial matters, including the annual budget, must be made in accordance with the default corporate weighted voting rules. And those rules are set out and they differ from the high bar that we've suggested here. So in recognizing that, we said, well, let's try to take a slightly different approach that still allows us to ensure that there is an indication of broad support for these key decisions going forward. And so we've set up the committee then to have at that committee level all matters voted on using the 2/3 supermajority approach, which combined with the membership of the committee would ensure that on all matters going forward, there was a broad level of support. We suggested that because the full board and all of the local governments as part of this discussion and a part of future discussions going forward on this service, because all local governments would be fully aware of this system going in and would be hopefully in support of this governance model, that would then compel the board to receive recommendations from the committee, knowing that those committee recommendations had broad support and quite a bit of legitimacy coming to the board. So the board can never be treated as a rubber stamp in these matters, but we would hope that it would take those recommendations in the spirit in which they were made, and that is again with that broad support. The fourth and final service element in the framework is deals with funding, and what we suggested is to start. Funding is actually broken down in the framework document into a number of different parts, and one of the key parts is the total amount of funding. And what we've suggested here is that before we can start to put together a more robust budget that would include amount for acquisitions, there needs to be some time taken upon service establishment to do some important first steps, which would include strategic planning for the service and would also include the development of a land acquisition strategy. So we've suggested a modest requisition of $275,000 in the first year to provide funding for those endeavors and for some other matters as well. That translates into about $6 for representative residents across the region. We've suggested then, Acting Mayor, that incrementally every year there would be an increase determined by committee recommendation and ratified by the board of directors. And as I noted, all of or as I've suggested, all of the incremental annual increases would be informed by that very important strategic plan and the land acquisition strategy. So all of that information needs to be put in place before more robust budgets going forward could be anticipated and set out. Just two more points to raise before I turn off the microphone, as it were. And one deals with the Comox First Nations. What we've suggested in here, we've not wanted to be presumptuous on how the Comox First Nation may wish to participate or not participate or collaborate in some fashion in the service. But what we've suggested is that local governments would commit to consulting and, where possible, collaborating with the Comox First Nation, and that collaboration could, and certainly the consultation could and would apply to the acquisition of lands, the operation of regional parks and trails, and the protection of important ecosystems. So we would certainly then, and the board, I think, has demonstrated this approach in past efforts with Comox First Nation on other services. We would expect the board to reach out and engage with the Comox First Nation to determine how the Comox First Nation wished to collaborate on this type of service. With respect to next steps, and Mark kind of touched on this a little bit, we are here now at feedback, getting local governments, asking local governments to provide input on the study and on the framework to the CVRD for inclusion in a report to the board, which would come forward once we finish these presentations to the local governments. If the service is supported then by the board through the service bylaw establishing process, each local government would be asked to provide a letter of support to become a participant in the service. And if the service is adopted by the board, the service would be funded in the starting 2023. And so we'd get into that 2023-2027 financial plan. And again, the strategic planning process and the land acquisition strategy would be undertaken in that first year with those funds. I will stop there, Acting Mayor Hillian, and be happy to answer any questions the council may have.
Thanks. And I'll just ask you to leave your microphone on, and then we won't have to be turning it on and off. Thanks very much to both Alan and Mark. And I see that this very significant report has already generated a number of questions. And we'll turn it over to our CAO, Mr. Garbett, for his initial comments. So your seat number 15. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Through the acting mayor to council, we didn't have a staff introduction. I just wanted to just potentially, before you ask your questions to staff, just outline our staff recommendation is based on, I think, very thorough analysis that's been done at the regional level. I have actually worked with Mr. Nielsen on a regional park service review and found that his approach and the support that's come through the coordinating committee was really good. Really, at a staff level, there's a demonstrated need. The proposed service is phased, and it comes from a strategic position. Regional parks have the potential to support all of the 4 regional strategies that were core to the creation of the Comox Valley Regional District, as well as the direction in our newly drafted official community plan. I think critical for our side of this engagement is that the service will be phased and the requisition will be based on a strategic plan that's developed. And I think when you look at the background information, that's very good, that these regional parks are supported by a real core work on what needs to be protected regionally, what's identified, how to achieve that, and have a development strategy, both on the acquisition side. So really, that represents a really good opportunity. I think in the past, there may have been some perceived threats to areas. That's not a good position to be in when you're looking at regionalizing and protecting parks. The city has always taken steps to maintain and identify natural areas. Hereford Hill Nature Park was early in our life. The 2 pieces of crown land that were purchased. So the city has a history of focusing on environmentally sensitive areas in big chunks for parks. So it's consistent with our big picture as well. I just wanted to thank Mr. Rushton for putting together an overview, and our recommendation is on page 9 of the agenda.
Thanks very much, Mr. Garbett, and we'll go to Councillor Frisch.
Thanks, Acting Mayor, and thanks, CEO, for your comments. I definitely enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much. Mark and Mr. Nielsen. of course, I'm a big supporter of this idea, and you made some really great points about increasing population. And of course, we're looking at densification in our town centers, and getting out to parks is a really important part of keeping our community healthy. So with that, I hope you don't mind. I'm happy to move the recommendation right now, just get it on the floor. Is that okay with you, Acting Mayor?
No problem.
Yeah,
If
I'll
you'd
move
like to
that.
read it out.
I'll move that based on the March 28th, 22 staff report entitled Proposed Regional Parks and Greenway Service, Council approve option 1 and provide correspondence to the CVRD indicating support for the creation of a regional parks and greenway service in accordance with the Regional Parks Proposed Service Background Study, February 2022, and Regional Parks Proposed Service Framework, March 2022.
Seconded by Councillor McCollum, who has the floor now. Let's see, seat number 17. Yes.
Thanks, Acting Mayor. Yeah, I'm really happy to see this report coming forward. Of course, we've known about it for some time, and I think there was a fair amount of enthusiasm for this even before this background study was presented. I think we've seen a few examples of potential missed opportunities in terms of conservation and how we address growth pressures in our region. And, you know, it's not unique. It's not a unique situation, but it's a particularly difficult issue that we have in the Comox Valley, that most of the lands that are still forested and just outside of our borders are privately held forest lands. There's not a lot of crown land, and even when it comes to accessing the provincial park, Strathcona, a lot of the access is private roads. So I think there's been a recognition in our community for a long time that this is a gap, and I'm really happy to see that we're seeking an opportunity to address the gap that we've had in our conservation efforts. One thought that I had around the cost per average household is approximately $6, and I just had a quick look on the National Park website for accessing Long Beach. Just to go for a beach walk is $6.50 per adult for a beach walk. So $6 to get this ball rolling seems, or $6.50 seems like a bargain. Or no, $6, I guess, is what was in the report. One question I had, I guess I actually have two questions. One is around Greenway development as a regional asset. We received quite a bit of correspondence and advocacy around the E&N corridor and developing that as a regional trail. And I'm wondering if this service would allow for us to do park development on lands that we don't actually acquire.
Thank you. Through the acting mayor, if I can, thank you, Councillor McCollum. Yes, it depends what kind of tenure we're able to get for that. So if there is a right of way, if there is some kind of agreement, some kind of license of occupation, as it were, different types of tenure agreements would allow the regional district, would give the regional district the right to do different types of improvements to those areas. It doesn't have to be owned kind of fee simple to do that. So that is definitely a possibility.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure there's many people that'll be thinking about that when they hear of this service being developed. And then the other question I had just was around the service framework. And obviously the main priority is conservation, but there is the aspect of developing these lands that we would acquire for public use. And sometimes those two things don't necessarily go together. Maybe there's a little stand of old growth that doesn't have good access, or maybe parking is not possible to develop. And would the framework, the way it's proposed, allow for us to look at those opportunities, even if it wouldn't necessarily be like accessible to our residents?
Thank you again. If through to Councillor McCollum, I think that the nice thing about the framework is that in saying that, in kind of laying out a path forward, one of the first steps on that path is to identify through strategic planning what exactly the jurisdictions and by extension the residents of the Comox Valley want to see in the different kind of within the definition and the different kind of categories of parks. So the answer is yes, it does provide for that scope. And if we take an example of most of the, or several at least, of the regional park services that we profiled in other regional districts, do have about 4 or 5 different types of parks within them. And if we look at Metro Vancouver, for example, but I know this to be the case as well in the Capital Regional District, they have their greenways as one. They have regionally significant areas. They have environmentally sensitive areas, and then they have conservation areas. And the conservation areas are ones that are acquired in order to kind of, in some cases, to kind of simply protect the land pending some kind of basic development or access or opportunities for people to access that in the future. And other conservation lands are acquired simply to provide protection, knowing that either because of some of the characteristics of those lands that you've anticipated or set out, or because of the geography or the location of those lands being too remote or too extreme in terms of slopes or what have you, that they'll never be accessible. And so there'll never be any kind of development. So there are those possibilities for sure, and different regional districts have kind of taken that into account and will have those categories of lands. And so I think it's just a function of what folks who contribute to the strategic planning process want to see here in the Comox Valley. I can fully anticipate there may be some sensitive ecosystems, for example, or some areas that people wish to conserve simply for the purpose of conservation and aren't interested in opening them up for access to the public. And in other cases, they'll want to provide opportunities to connect.
Great.
I should note too, and at the risk of droning on, I apologize, but as Mark knows, who's had to suffer through 3 other presentations thus far, I kind of get going on this topic because it's a fascinating one. And nevertheless, even within individual parks. So if we look at the Metro Vancouver example, and I only mention that because it's the one that I'm most familiar with in terms of the statistics and the details. But if we look at the region at the Metro Vancouver Park, which has some arguably some fairly developed parks. If you think of Pacific Spirit Regional Park near UBC and abutting the endowment lands there, gets over 2 million visitors a year. That's a lot of people in one park, even a big park. But even in that park, which is one of the most developed, 97% of the land is off limits to people. And so that's even then within different types of parks and different categories, it's possible to say these areas which we deem to be sensitive through our mapping, we shall never put trails through there, and we will put signs up saying that this area is off limits. So there's those possibilities too.
Thanks. Those are good insights. I appreciate it.
Thanks. And we'll go to Councillor Morin.
Thank you, Acting Mayor, and thank you to Councillor McCollum for asking one of my questions. I guess my piece, I know we talked about the $6 not being very much, but that's just to sort of get things going. When you actually have to go out and acquire a piece of land, it's pretty expensive. So one question was around the other regional park services. You know, how long did it take to, I mean, how much bang do you get for your buck? Like, do you get one park every 30 years or what when you're adding up the money? And then that also is sort of woven into the equity aspect, because I know that our colleagues in the electoral areas are often thinking that we kind of rule the roost, the municipalities, and they would like to have some parks that overlap their areas. There's some beautiful places, obviously, in Union Bay and the outskirts. And so I'm just wondering how things could be made equitable, other than trying to get taking everybody out for a nice meal and saying vote for my park idea, when you've only got one vote in those electoral areas. So those two are sort of woven together, I guess. Thanks.
Thank you, through the Acting Mayor, to Councillor Morin. Thank you for those questions. Excellent. All of these questions are excellent, by the way, if I may say so. What I think that how long to acquire and how does that look when we look at other places? First of all, one point to make, and we see if we look at the information in the background report, and there's a lot of information in there. So everybody is forgiven if they haven't mastered all of the details from that report. Nevertheless, if you look at that report, you see that in other regional districts, the per household or the representative household impact ranges from $45 to $96 in a year, in a given year. So $100 and down seems to be about kind of, and Metro Vancouver is the one at 46, and that's partly because it has such a huge non-residential tax base to help kind of cover to help pay the cost on that one, and such a large assessment base to begin with. But when we look then at how do we acquire, if we're collecting that much money, how do we then start to kind of build that fund to acquire, and how long does it take to acquire lands? There's kind of two answers. One is when we enter a service like this, we're kind of playing the long game. So, and that's not always the greatest news for some people, because some people see their needs very quickly. We want to start to capitalize and address some of those needs, and that can be done. But we also want to kind of look at the long game. And if we look at other regional districts, we see that these services tended to start small, and kind of in many cases in kind of fits and starts, and they didn't have full participation, then they did, and then they kind of had a kind of two steps forward and then one step back. And we saw that in the case of the Comox Valley Regional District as well, or the Comox Strathcona as it was in the day when it started with its regional park service, which ended up kind of being dissolved at one point. Nevertheless, playing the long game is kind of important in this. That said, when we look at some other places, Central Okanagan Regional District, the regional district in which I'm located, we see there that they were actually very successful in acquiring quite a few lands through purchase and other means over a 10-year period between 2007 and 2017. And they did that largely through borrowing. So even though we're only collecting, and they're about $100 a year, even per household, even though we're only collecting $100 per year for household, that gives us enough to then start in a short order to actually start to debt finance some of these land purchases. So, and to look at other acquisition tools as well. So they were actually so successful in acquiring a robust set of lands, because they identified in the early 2000s that they were land deficient in the regional park service, and that they were not protecting as many environmentally sensitive areas as they wanted to be protecting. They found that they were able to have a very aggressive land acquisition strategy in place for those 10 years, and that by the end of that 10-year period, they actually had to kind of pull back a little bit and said, okay, we're going to now lower this acquisition because we've got a lot now. And now we need to start to look at different ways to do modest improvements to some of these so we can provide people access to them. So I think long story short is it is possible, even though it's a small amount, once you start to build that up based on your acquisition strategy, it is possible to start to get enough monies put aside to start to look at different debt financing and other types of approaches to start to acquire lands. The other question then, if I may, with respect to the equity, I think that the best way to address that is when we have a service like this, and we see this in each of the other 6 regional districts that have these successful services, we want to make sure that we are making acquisitions in line with an acquisition strategy. So the process of putting that strategy together is the process of identifying the different types of criteria that are going to be important to acquire the lands that most fit the definition and the mandate of the service. So if the mandate of the service, for example, is to first and foremost to protect sensitive natural areas, then in building the acquisition strategy, a key consideration that the parties would presumably want to take into account would be, what does our sensitive ecosystem mapping in the region look like? And let's kind of take away the political boundaries for a moment and look at where those are. And then later, layer on the political boundaries and say, even though, yes, sensitive ecosystems is a very important criterion, we live in the real world, and we also know that interjurisdictional equity is an important criterion. So we want to, wherever possible, ensure that we have spread out throughout the region over a period of time, which could be 10 years or 15 years, for example, acquisition, so that everybody knows that even though this year may not be the year that we're acquiring this particular land in our jurisdiction, we know that in 5 years it's on the list for that. So we're comfortable defending the system in that sense.
Thanks very much, and we'll move to Mr. Garbett.
Through the acting mayor to Councillor Morin, I think what's going to be really important is that strategic planning exercise, as Sir Nielsen has referenced, the question around equity. There's two components. There's the paying of equity and the location of equity. We're very fortunate that it's a very small region. There's a lot of background work that's done, but we can't forget that there are a number of other tools to secure parkland as well as environmental protection. Groundwater protection development permit areas, environmentally sensitive development permit areas, subdivision approvals, leveraging development approvals. And so we've done that very successfully through the municipality with a number of different initiatives. And the regional district has an opportunity in the development of their settlement nodes to continue that. Where the discussion is going to happen is in the non-development areas. And I guess I would highlight that there is two aspects. Our regional growth strategy focuses on limiting the public cost of development, environmental protection, but it also calls resource lands for resource uses. So we have to remember that there's a huge area out there that is not intended to be sprawling suburban houses. It is working lands for some component of that, and then there'll be a balance. So I think a critical analysis will happen through the region to identify what and how and where and why, because there's a lot of tension that happens between these three things. And the involvement of First Nations, particularly with respect to resource lands for resource uses and these parks initiatives, is very important, because forestry and parks can go in hand, and we also have watershed protection issues. It's really, really exciting and important, this function, and really glad that there's going to be that due diligence in terms of setting up this service to chart the path. And many regional districts that have been at this, and the 50-year reference with Alan is wonderful, is it really becomes one of the critical activities that happens at the regional level.
Thanks, Mr. Garbett, and thanks very much to our presenters. I'll just acknowledge that, particularly during the pandemic, I think we all acquired a new appreciation for our parks, and I thought oftentimes about the foresight of the civic-minded people who created them and prepared the way, as well as, of course, our hardworking staff who do all the planning and maintenance of these wonderful areas. And hoping that this is a step that will be recognized with that same foresight when we look back in the years to come and see the great parks that this service will provide. And with that, we do have the recommendation on the floor. All those in favor? And no one opposed. That's unanimous. Thanks very much. Thank you very much. So the next item on our agenda, 4.2, is the Downtown Courtenay Business Improvement Association budget and tax levy request. And Councillor Frisch.
Thanks, Acting Mayor. I'll move that Council approve the Downtown Courtenay Business Improvement Association 2022 budget and 2022 tax levy request in the amount of $60,000.
Seconded by Councillor Morin, and over to Mr. Garbett.
Thank you. Through the Acting Mayor, Ms. Vaika is here for any questions if you have. The report gives an overview of the implementation.
And Ms. Vaika, we don't have any questions, but I'll give you the floor for any comment you would like to make.
Okay, thank you through the CEO to Acting Mayor and Council. So this is a housekeeping item that we have to do each year in order for us to levy the annual $60,000 request for the DCBIA. And Council needs to approve the request as well as the 2022 DCBIA budget. Bylaw 2264 is in place and it authorizes this tax levy request. And I'll open up for any questions if you have them. Thank you.
And seeing none, we'll acknowledge that this is a routine matter that comes forward every year, and we all acknowledge our appreciation of the downtown business and the good work they do at the heart of our community. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. Thanks very much. And we shall move on to item 4.22, the grant request from the Comox Guardian Watchman Program. Councillor McCollum.
Thanks, Acting Mayor. I'll move the CAO recommendations that based on the March 28th, 2022 staff report, grant request, Comox Guardian Watchman Program, Council approve option 1, which is to provide a $5,000 grant to Comox Guardian Watchman Program for the 2022 calendar year, and that the grant be paid from the city's host gaming funds account under the other council initiatives and projects distribution category, and direct staff to work with Comox First Nation regarding future funding during the budget deliberations in 2023 and the 5-year financial plan.
Seconded by Councillor Morin, and over to Mr. Garbett.
Thank you. Through the acting mayor, I really appreciate council's consideration of this matter. We have an ongoing relationship with Comox First Nation, and their Guardians program works very closely with our development community. It works closely with our bylaw enforcement staff, and it's becoming a really functional forward-facing unit for Comox First Nation. It's a relatively small amount to contribute for this calendar year, and the upcoming financial year. And I really would consider this could be part of our core budget deliberations as opposed to gaming discussions. However, we feel that's a discussion for our deliberation for an incoming council. If you have any other questions, I'm available, and Comox is aware that this is on the agenda tonight.
Thanks, and I don't see any questions or comments. Thanks very much to finance staff for working this through, and to staff for bringing it forward. I think it helps to cement our ongoing positive relationship with the Comox First Nation and acknowledge the work that the Guardians do, as noted by our CAO. All those in favor? And there are none opposed. That carries unanimously. Thank you. And we'll move on to 4.3 engineering services, the 6th Street Active Transportation Bridge grant application. And we'll go over to Councillor Morin.
Great, thank you, Acting Mayor. Yes, I'll move that based on the March 28th, 2022 staff report, 6th Street Active Transportation Bridge grant application, council approve option 1 and direct staff to submit an application for grant funding for the 6th Street Active Transportation Bridge project through Infrastructure Canada's Active Transportation Fund.
Seconded by Councillor Frisch, and over to Mr. Garbett.
Thank you. As council is aware, this is an important strategic priority with our current strategic plan. Mr. Davidson's been leading these discussions, and he has a short presentation for you.
And he also made stellar efforts to get over here from City Hall, so we shall turn the floor over to Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Jeff. Through the CAO to Mayor and Council. So the purpose of this report is to seek approval for staff to submit an application for grant funding for the 6th Street Active Transportation Bridge project through Infrastructure Canada's Active Transportation Fund. So the Active Transportation Fund will invest in projects that build new and expanded networks of pathways, bike lanes, trails, and pedestrian bridges, in addition to supporting active transportation planning and stakeholder engagement activities. So total estimated costs for construction for the 6th Street Bridge are $4.17 million. If the grant is approved, 60% of eligible project costs could be covered by the funding. Based on our most recent Class C cost estimate, the grant would fund approximately $2.5 million of eligible expenditures. As such, staff are recommending to submit an application for grant funding for the 6th Street Active Transportation Bridge project through Infrastructure Canada's Active Transportation Fund. And with that, happy to take any questions.
And while council are considering whether to ask you a question, I'll just ask, would the successful receipt of this grant mean that we wouldn't be eligible for other grants, or is that still a possibility?
Excellent question. Thank you very much. Through the CAO to Mayor and Council. Yes, it would be possible to pursue other grants if we were successful. So this grant does allow grant stacking. However, it's just a question if other grants would also allow grant stacking that we may, so we have to synchronize between the two.
Fair enough. Thanks. Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, not surprisingly, my question is much along the same line. Just doing some quick math here, it's $40 million across Canada over 5 years, which is about 80 million a year right across Canada. I'm just wondering if we have any sense of what the likelihood of success on this grant, just given how broad, our country is versus how relatively limited the funding is, and just if we have any sense of that ahead of time.
Mr. Garbutt would like to weigh in on that.
Thank you. Through the acting mayor to Councillor McCollum, we'll give you the political answer. There's no guarantees on any grants. We do know that through outreach, through our UBCM meetings, we have been contacted by the Ministry of Transportation. We have had some discussions. It's an important project. And because of its location within the heart of our community and the fact that it has external linkages to regional transportation, active transportation routes, could be seen with a lens of community economic development, et cetera. We're hopeful that it will be able to be a very attractive and fundable project.
That's great. That's really reassuring. And then just along the lines of the acting mayor's questions, have we flagged any other funding opportunities that are coming available, or is there some other opportunities that will come through this in the next few months, or if you have anything to add on that?
Yes, thank you. There are some opportunities coming up, specifically active transportation grants. Still reviewing internally which projects we pursue for those. So we'll have to be strategic about that, whether or not they allow grant stacking. So yes, there are some opportunities coming up.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you. And over to Councillor Frisch.
Thanks very much. I just had a question about if we're successful, the process to fundraise the other 1.7 million. Would that be contingent on some sort of approval process?
Mr. Garbutt.
Electoral approval process, to be clear.
Depending on through the acting mayor to Councillor Frisch, it would depend on the grants that are available. We may be in a borrowing position. But at this time, we won't be able to say. But if we were in a total borrowing position, we would have to get approval, is my understanding. And that process takes a bit of time. Critical to this is the steps that council has directed and authorized us to be shovel ready. I think that's the thing. We've also engaged about some of the cultural components related to this. I mean, it effectively is a piece of public art, very functional and important active transportation route, but also has a number of functions. So I would mention that there is another granting program through Island Coastal Economic Trust that we may be able to look at, but that is contingent on wider linkages and a demonstration of what this community economic development could be. But we will exhaust all efforts. Could be a very, very important project through our entire valley, and we'd probably likely look for other support from other jurisdictions.
Yeah, and a quick follow-up. I'm really excited about this. Obviously, thank you very much for bringing this forward and making this grant application ready to go. I had a question about the infrastructure on either side, and just to clarify, is that included in this amount? Something to get up 6th Street, something to get through the park?
Excellent question. Thank you. Minimal infrastructure on both sides. So the scope of the project really is the 6th Street Bridge. There'll be some considerations, of course, for safety to connect to the Riverway Trail on the downtown side. And then there'll be some improvements in the local area on the park side, redirecting some trailways and installing some artworks potentially as well. And then, of course, some lighting for safety. So there will be some improvements to ensure connectivity, but not significant.
Well, it sounds reasonable for now. Thanks.
Thank you. And Councillor Theos.
Thanks, Acting Mayor. Yeah, Chris, I'm curious to know if we've taken into consideration, based on the bridge work that we did at 5th Street Bridge and the grant application that we had in and received, and when we actually went to do the work, the costs actually ballooned and escalated. Now, have we taken a look at the risk of potentially if this amount could escalate, or are we seeing less potential of a risk of that based on 2 different bridges?
Excellent question. Thank you very much. Through the CAO to Mayor and Council. That really is a very good question. So it's a question of cost escalation. The short answer is yes, we have. So the cost estimate we're referencing is technically dated 2020 and we're in 2022. However, the cost estimate was developed the end of 2020 and we're in early 2022. So it's not that old. So we do believe it is still very relevant. Further, we are carrying a fairly healthy contingency for this project just to account for exactly that. Materials escalation, contractor escalation, and some foreseen environmental concerns working in the area as well. So it has been factored in. We do note in the reports, we will be developing more detailed cost estimates as we continue to progress through detailed design. And notably, the grant actually does allow more detailed cost estimates to be submitted at the time of approval. So we do expect there to be some changes, but we don't expect them to be significant.
And Mr. Garbutt.
I think as council is aware, we've seen these implications for our infrastructure projects, and we've been pretty deliberate in developing the budgets. And I really appreciate the focus we have on when we make these grant applications. We need to really look at what we can and feel is inside the market. I think given this is effectively a new build, not a renovation, some of those costs for the construction itself are a little bit easier to estimate. So
Thanks very much to staff. I will just note that we did speak to the previous Minister of Transportation with regards to this project, but we have a new transportation minister, and it might behoove us to make representations either at UBCM or otherwise to Minister Fleming and explore the possibility that we could get provincial support for this project as well as these grants that are happening. So perhaps we can consider that when we're looking at UBCM, but with no further discussion right now, we will call the question, and all those in favor. And there's none opposed, so that passes unanimously. Thank you, staff, and we shall move on to 4.41, Malcolm Morrison Senior Park Environmental Assessment. And we have Councillor Fish.
Yes, thank you. I'll move that based on the March 28th, 2022 staff report entitled Malcolm Morrison Senior Park Environmental Assessment. The council approves option 1 and directs staff to develop an environmental management plan aimed to address the midterm recommendation and to pursue brownfield redevelopment grant opportunities through the Community Works Fund.
Seconded by Councillor McCollum, and over to Mr. Garbutt.
thank you, Mayor and Council. Mr. Shaw and Mr. Kearns is here to give an overview of the Malcolm Morrison Senior Park report.
Mr. Shaw.
Yes, thank you. Through the CAO to Acting Mayor and Council, I'm pleased to present staff report, Malcolm Morrison Senior Park Environmental Assessment. This is a rather interesting file and required a bit of investigation, as the history of this particular site goes back quite a few years. And so we had to go and dig up a few boxes to uncover exactly what has transpired over the years, so that we can have a fulsome review and present the report that's in front of you here today. So in saying that, I prepared a bit of an overview and some background to provide context to some of the information, and I'll run through that for you right now. As I said, the purpose of this report is to present council with background information regarding the park's history and options related to the outcome of the environmental assessment. The park is approximately 2-hectare property located between Embleton Crescent and First Street. The property is a fee simple lot that was incorporated into the city in 1975 boundary extension. Before this time, the property functioned as a municipal landfill for approximately 30 years. And although not dedicated as parkland, the property functions as a passive green space for today. After closing the landfill, much of the site was reportedly capped with construction type waste, including gravels, cobbles, some concrete and asphalt debris. Due to the presence of this remaining disposable debris, area residents have raised concerns related to public safety and potential environmental impacts. In response to these concerns, staff commissioned an environmental assessment of the property over the summer of 2021. This environmental assessment aimed to build on the 1992 environmental assessment conducted by Thurber Environmental, which was commissioned at the time as the city was considering the creation of an open park space. Through the course of 2021 assessment, the property was confirmed to have signs of surface debris consisting of construction type waste. Additionally, Staff met with the staff from the Municipal Insurance Association to do a loss and control inspection of the park. The inspection also built on the urban systems assessment and highlighted potential hazards for park users, specifically the rubble and debris dispersed amongst the trees along some of the unsanctioned trails leading to those areas. Some of the short-term corrective actions that were identified by MIABC aim to address immediate safety concerns and will be completed within the 2022 parks maintenance budget. The midterm recommendations, however, are subject to further analysis, risk-based assessments, and a conclusive cost estimate. It is recommended that these investigative works proceed and that the results are included in an environmental management plan, and therefore staff are recommending the development of an environmental management plan aimed to address the midterm recommendations and to pursue future brownfield redevelopment grant opportunities through the Community Works Fund. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions council may have.
Thanks very much, Mr. Shaw. And are there any questions or comments from council? I'll just note that I've certainly heard from people in the neighborhood about this, and I'm actually curious about why it's taken us this many years to notice that something needed to be done here.
It's a great question. Thank you to the CAO, to acting mayor and council. It's a question I think we ask ourselves in the public works world. I will say this, historically speaking, and to the time it led up today, you'll see in the agenda package on page 160 of 225, the recommendations out of the Thurber report recommend that through the closure of that site that they simply cap it with simple soils and allow the vegetation to reimmerse through that property. And if we had maybe had hindsight and done that 30 years ago, we'd be in a lot better place today. That is a little bit more of a difficult journey for us to go apart today. But I think from then until just most recently, and if I may, in the last 5 years or so, the space itself has been relatively untouched. It hasn't seen a lot of active use, but however, through our operations and our parks management plans, most recently within the 5 years, our parks maintenance team has provided much more formal access through that particular space to provide access from First Street to the Embleton playground. And that formalization of that path has now provided opportunity for eyes on a site that was otherwise unviewed. And that's brought forth some of these conversations today.
Right, and I take it there's not much likelihood that this would be accepted as a regional park if we get the new. Mr. Garbett, did you have any comments? Okay, well, certainly glad to see this coming, and I know the residents will be too, and we'll look forward to achieving that grant. All in favor of the motion? And there's no one opposed. That carries unanimously. And if I might just also take this opportunity to pass on to you and Mr. Kearns our appreciation for the excellent management of the tremendous parks that we have in the city of Courtenay. That was noted in the previous report, and I meant to mention it then. Thank you. All right, we'll move on, and we have 5.1, the Comox Valley Economic Development Service conversion bylaw. I'm trying to make sure I don't make any more speech errors today. Who'd like to move this one?
I'll second that.
Just received. Yes, I believe you're correct. So would staff like to make any comment on this, Mr. Garbett?
Thank you. Through the acting mayor, we need to pass a motion as per the letter on page 203 that the city of Courtenay consent to the adoption of Comox Valley Regional District bylaw number 702, being Comox Valley Economic Development Service Conversion Bylaw 345-216, amendment number 2 under section 346 of the Local Government Act, I believe.
Right. My apologies. It's taking me a while to manipulate my agenda as well as the speakers. Councillor McCollum.
In that case, I'll move that council consents to the bylaw as outlined in the letter from the CVRD, and I'll read it, that the city of Courtenay consent to the adoption of the Comox Valley Regional District Bylaw number 702 being Comox Valley Economic Development Service Conversion Bylaw number 345, 2016, Amendment number 2 under section 346 of the Local Government Act.
And I'm assuming there's no objections to us dispensing with the earlier receipt motion. Thank you. Any questions or comments in relation to this motion and this letter? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. And we now have the internal reports and correspondence for information. Parks and Recreation Advisory, Heritage Advisory, and Heritage Advisory a second time. And I'm going to ask for one motion to accept all three of these. But first, I'll turn it over to Ms. O'Connell, who has some comments in relation to this.
Thank you, Acting Mayor Hillian. Council, this is a bit of a new process for the Legislative Services Department. So in the past, you would be receiving minutes upon the adoption from each of the respective committees. As you're well aware, there can be very large gaps from one meeting to the next, resulting in council not being aware of what the actions of the committee were until months later. So essentially, you're going to be seeing minutes in the future coming in draft form onto the agenda for receipt. In the event that the committee at a future meeting amends those minutes will then come back for further receipt.
Thanks very much. And could I have a motion, Councillor Morin?
Sure. I'll move that the three minutes, the Parks and Rec and 2 Heritage Advisory Commission minutes all be received. Thank you.
Thanks. And is that the correct wording, Madam Clerk? Thank you. The only comment I had in relation to these was that there seemed to be some interesting discussion at the Parks and Rec Advisory, which I believe was a follow-up to some comments at council meetings about some diversity of membership and other issues. And I don't know if Mr. Rushton wants to comment on that at all.
I can provide a quick comment on that for sure. So through the mayor to the CEO, there was discussion at our last meeting about involving more diversity in representing that board. And Councillor Morin was at that meeting too. And we had discussed, she had some linkages with possible youth and accessibility. Youth to speak through an accessibility lens, and there was a good uptake with the group around that, and there is going to be more of a focus now on trying to incorporate some diverse members to that group too. So it's a work in progress.
Great, thanks very much. And Councillor Morton.
Thank you, Acting Mayor. I just wanted to note that these minutes are from February 3rd, and I attended the March 3rd meeting. So I don't really have anything to report on the February 3rd meeting, but I do have notes from the next one. Thanks.
Fair enough. And I'll just comment that we really appreciate the engagement of our Heritage and Parks and Rec Advisory Committees. I note that Judy Hagan put in something like 100 hours in 1 month in relation to her duties with the Heritage Committee. And I think that's commendable of these citizens to step forward in this way. All those in favor of the receipt? And that's unanimous. Thank you. And I believe we've come to reports from council members, and we'll start, we'll go around and see if anybody has anything. Councillor Fish, Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, this week gone by, what was that, Thursday, March 24th, I attended the AGM for the Municipal Finance Authority in person in Victoria. I think it was the first in-person conference for not just a lot of the trustees from the board, but many of the presenters and staff members. It was really nice being back in person. We had some really interesting presentations. The first one being the chief economist for BMO presenting his outlook for 2022, and just we've been through a couple years of a lot of wild, changes in our markets and, our economy, but 2022 is shaping up to be probably even more unpredictable. And he said that in his 40 years of doing work in economics, he's never seen an inflationary environment like the one that we're in currently. And he said he had that assessment prior to the Ukrainian war breaking out. And of course, that's, increased that risk and that impact even more. He was predicting that the inflation rate in the US for March may be as high as 8%, which I don't think that's been recorded in any of the last 4 decades. And he pointed out that a lot of, and we also have a very tight labor market, which existed before the pandemic and is more significant now. Combined with these inflationary pressures, we're likely to see a lot of difficulty with labor and labor negotiations as well. He said that times of high inflationary times have led to a lot of labor conflict, and that's likely to be a predominant issue for local government going into the next year. So I just thought I would share those because I think most people would be interested to just hear how unusual our inflationary environment is right now. And the other thing that he forecast was that most likely each time that the Bank of Canada and the US Federal Reserve meets for the rest of the year is likely to see interest rates go up each and every time. So he was predicting somewhere between 1.5 and 2% prime lending, overnight lending rate to increase between now and the end of the year. So yeah, there is changes afoot. And then the other thing that was presented was from the MFA that they have a new investment product that is coming online. Actually, it was released in January, available for local government, that'll move away from strictly being able to purchase bonds, and that it's going to be a pooled blended fund that local government can now buy something that blends equities and bonds together in order to realize higher gains on our reserves and our long-term investments. It's meant to be a vehicle for reserves that are intended to be held for more than 10 years, but the projected earnings are closer to 6% rather than a traditional 2%. So it should be something that's attractive to basically any local government that's using the MFA for holding reserves, provided that they're intended to be used with a long investment horizon. So I thought I would share that as well. And I think that's probably enough talking.
Well, thanks, Councillor McCollum. Although I'm not exactly cheered up by your presentation, we all appreciate your financial acumen and your efforts in going forward there. Councillor Morin?
Oh, yeah. I was just very impressed with Councillor McCollum. Just definitely the right person for this appointment. So did a great job.
Did you have anything to report?
Oh, I thought you just want to comment on a critique on Councillor McCollum. I would just report that there were others. I think that, Acting Mayor Hillian attended the High Ground online conference with Columbia Institute, and we're actually getting conferences happening again, this one was online, but there are some coming up in person. And I just found it really invigorating to connect with other elected officials in other areas on many great topics. I found that almost every topic I attended was really informative. So maybe Acting Mayor has more to say on that, but I appreciate being able to attend. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Morin. I will comment on that. But first, Councillor Theus, did you want to say anything?
Well, I just wanted to comment on of course, as you may all know, that there is the librarian strike with the library, and unfortunately there isn't anything that I can report right now that can give us confidence that that will be ending soon. So, but I will keep everybody updated as information continues to come in, and I will make sure that everyone's updated on where that's going.
Thanks very much, Councillor Theus. So I'll just add that I did have the opportunity to attend the Columbia Institute virtual conference on Thursday, Friday, Saturday last week. And I'll just highlight a couple of the workshops for council's information. There was an excellent session on reframing the police response to mental health issues with the head of the Canadian Mental Health Association and an individual who did the study for the city of Halifax, among others, councillor from the Victoria City Council. An excellent session on seniors care and significant. City of New Westminster had 28 deaths during the heat dome last summer. And it was certainly acknowledged that older citizens are disproportionately affected by the climate-related disasters that we're seeing. And of course, all of these sessions were focused on the municipal response and engagement on these issues. A session on housing and quite a remarkable presentation by a fellow named Andrew Nielsen, who is the housing coordinator for the city of Merritt. As you know, Merritt lost a lot of its homes in the flooding and the fires, and they're actually building 20 new homes that are being they're 3D print structures. And I actually saw the process of constructing these. $144,000 per house, about $4 million for 20 houses. 640 square feet, they can be constructed in 35 to 40 days, and the city's providing the land. And this is one of the efforts that's underway to help those citizens get reestablished. There's also an excellent session on the toxic drug crisis. So all in all, a lot of relevant material. And with that, we have come to the end of today's council meeting. I want to thank all of the staff who are here, and in particular, Ms. O'Connell, for having to sort out all the technical problems that we've had. We were able to resume the meeting and get it over with in a decent time. I'd like to thank all of council for being here today. And with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Moved by Frisch, seconded by McCollum. All those in favor? Carried unanimously. Thanks very much, everyone.